Hi, I'm Marco Cucito-Manoc with the Greater New Orleans Foundation. I direct our regional initiatives, and this is the third of 5 installments in our Urban Water series. So we're delighted that we're at the so-called hump stage of this, and we welcome you. Thank you for coming. And I see Carrie Shea, an old friend, in the audience. Thanks for coming. So I wanted to just go over a quick overview of why we're doing this. I think although New Orleans has really focused for a long time on the Dutch, certainly post-Katrina, it's not like we're eschewing the Dutch model by any means. We simply want to focus at U.S. cities that are facing similar challenges, especially financial challenges, which we know are quite different within a European government that confronts them on a national level versus American cities that have to take them on by themselves. And so we have 2 really interesting cities tonight in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Portland, Oregon. So we really thank our guests for coming out for this one. And another reason we're doing this is that water, as you may know, is a pretty gargantuan issue in not only this city, but in this region. NOLA, New Orleans, is the 3rd rainiest city in the country. We get, on average, 64 inches of rainfall a year. That's a lot. And it's only 3 inches less than the leading city in the country, which is Mobile, Alabama. So we get a lot of rain. And it floods a lot, so it's important that we learn how to deal with this more effectively than we have been. Another reason is that we're the fastest sinking landmass in the world. I'm giving you all these great sort of inspiring bits of information just to lift your spirits, if nothing else. But the good news in all of this is that our subsidence problem can be stopped. By reintroducing water into the subsoil, into the substratum, we can actually stop this trend. And I think that's the important thing. And finally, there's no guarantee that we're going to have all of this access to the fresh water that we have today. It's something that people like Mark Davis, one of our original speakers who's in the back of the room, and we thank him for coming again, has talked about for a long time. Cities as far away as Las Vegas, Nevada, believe it or not, have designs on our Mississippi River water and want to divert some of it to meet their increasing needs. So, finding ways of actually dealing with fresh water and holding on to it are becoming important across the globe. So let's begin by talking a little bit about our example cities tonight. We'll begin with Milwaukee, although we'll start with Portland and Bill in our presentations. But let's talk a little bit about Milwaukee. Milwaukee actually began its water management revolution with gray infrastructure. And we'll see that in the case of both cities tonight. They began with gray infrastructure and have moved to green infrastructure and are integrating them in really clever, creative ways that we'll learn about in more detail in just a minute. Milwaukee began with an underground storage system that is massive, and since 2011 has begun to complement this approach with green strategies. It's recently been featured in Forbes and the Atlantic Cities as the Silicon Valley of fresh water. So it's a hot city. It's making news because of its success in developing expertise in cleaning, delivering, and protecting fresh water. It is, in short, very successfully using progressive water management as an economic development tool, something that we've been talking about doing for quite a while now. We started with Steve Piku and Grasshopper Mendoza and our friends at the Idea Village, the Water Challenge, which just completed its 3rd year, with the intention of actually creating a water industry around this, right? But to do that, we need to create regulations within the city that actually make the creation of these industries possible and are friendly to their development. So that's an important thing, and Milwaukee can teach us some things about that. It's now working, the city of Milwaukee is now working on a regional green infrastructure plan with 27 other municipalities that should be completed this month, we hear, and that should be on track, the last I've heard, so great, thumbs up. And like Philadelphia and Houston, the 2 cities we highlighted at our last convening 2 weeks ago, Milwaukee is also very much engaged in planting large numbers of trees on its green space. So planting trees actually helps because they drink up a lot of water and hold it in place. It's great to plant trees. The Johnny Appleseed message is being repeated many years after his unfortunate demise. And of course, rain barrels, like Chicago, Illinois. Milwaukee has distributed enough rain barrels to capture 1 million gallons of stormwater. That's kind of a lot. So it's interesting. And most importantly, from my point of view, Milwaukee is the home of Laverne and Shirley, the Fawns, and the Cunningham family all together. And that is nothing small. That is huge, actually, if you grew up in those days. I see smiles and I see looks of complete disapproval on some of your faces. So that's all right. Take it for what it's worth. Portland is our next city, and it too began its water management strategy ascent with an emphasis on gray infrastructure, and in 2008 launched its Gray to Green initiative. That is its transition to more green infrastructure. It has an innovative Green Streets program, which began on public property, but was expanded to include stormwater retention projects on private land as well. It's got a really cool eco-roof incentive program for privately owned buildings. It's something that's not too common. And of course, Portland is known as being a progressive city in many, many ways. So from planning to now green infrastructure, the introduction of green infrastructure. So it's always a great example from which we can learn. And then it actually has green street stewards, I was reading. These are volunteers who pick up trash and maintain the green street facilities, kind of like what they're doing in Mandeville. I was at a convening yesterday in Baton Rouge where we were talking about the Biggert Waters Act, and I heard from the floodplain manager of the city of Mandeville that they actually have what they call a drain team. And these are citizens who actually clean out drains before an approaching storm so that they won't clog up, so that the drains can actually work and filter the water away. And what they get in recompense for their efforts, for their voluntary efforts, is this really cool rain jacket that says a drain team on the back. And apparently that's enough to just get people motivated to come out in huge numbers. So this is good. Let me talk a little bit about today's speakers, as you seem to be getting a little bit tired of me, and understandably so. Bill Owen, we'll start with him. He's a senior engineer with the City of Portland's Bureau of Environmental Services. In this capacity, he manages an $80 million program that blends sustainable stormwater and traditional pipe solutions that jointly address health and sewer system challenges. In addition, if my old high school friend Rodney Finnegan is watching, Bill received a master's degree in civil engineering from Colorado State University up in beautiful Fort Collins, Colorado. Go Rams! Cam the Ram, I'm told, is the big one there. You're equally impressed with that, thank you. And our second speaker is Karen Sands. Karen has actually encountered some travel difficulties today that are rather nightmarish in scope, and she just made it here in time. So we thank her for going through all of that for us. So a big hand for Karen as well. Indeed, for both of our speakers. But Karen, we're going to give her a chance to catch her breath, and we'll start with Bill. But let me tell you a little bit about Karen, who is the manager of sustainability for the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. As such, she deals with green infrastructure, energy planning for conservation, and renewable and climate resiliency. The Milwaukee Metro Sewerage District provides water reclamation and flood management services for 1 million customers in 28 municipalities. So a pretty big deal. And our celebrity co-moderator, who is running a little bit late, is Councilmember James Gray, who has lived and worked in his adopted hometown of New Orleans for 36 years and has been a member of the District E community since 1988. A product of the Scotlandville, Louisiana Public Schools, Councilmember Gray received a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Morehouse College and a Juris Doctorate degree from Harvard University Law School. He served with the United States Marine Corps for 3 years, including a tour in Vietnam, where he was an infantry platoon commander, just like I was. As a practicing attorney, Councilmember Gray has worked on desegregation, civil and housing rights cases, and has served on numerous housing and neighborhood development boards. He's a former LSU law professor and president of the Louisiana Law Institute, and currently teaches trial practice at Tulane University. So he will be helping me to co-moderate, to ask questions of our group. And before we get started, just one practical note. Please wait to ask your questions until we're finished, until both speakers have actually had the chance to speak, and then wait until a microphone comes your way so that we can actually capture all of this on tape, because we're taping this. You can see it actually within 24 hours of the conclusion of this very session. So we thank you for your time and patience. And finally, a public service announcement. Our friends at Global Green New Orleans will be conducting a workshop that is highly relevant to the topics under discussion in this series. Their Living with Water discussion and site tour happens tomorrow evening between 5:30 and 7:30 at Propeller at 4035 Washington Avenue, right here in lovely New Orleans. So thank you very much for coming, and let me now start with, we said we'd start with Bill Owen.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to come down to New Orleans again. my wife and I moved from Montgomery, Alabama, where I was a consulting engineer, up to Portland in 2001, and some of my wife's family still live in Mobile, and so we have an opportunity to come here to see the beautiful city. I'm starting off with a slide that has a photo of our city's water pollution control lab. Basically, it's a chemistry lab. It was built in the late 90s that has, you can see, sort of a unique way of draining its rooftop. And this is a form of downspout disconnection that we see a lot in residential areas in our city, but we've applied it here in this setting as well. And there's a rain garden big button, where the water filtrates to. So one example of our green infrastructure. So I'm going to be talking about, giving you at least a preview of our city, the bureau that I work in, and Green Streets as part of the context. I'll talk a little bit about how green infrastructure and Green Streets in particular has evolved to the point where there's over 1,400 Green Street facilities in the city currently. I'll end with some example projects and some lessons learned from those projects or observations, and some concluding remarks. So the city of Portland is, of course, located in the Pacific Northwest at the confluence of the Columbia River and the Willamette River here. It has a residence of about 500,000 people. And we see about 37 inches of rainfall, which is less than what you folks see. But our 10-year event, given our rainfall patterns, is only 3.5 inches, which is, I think, about half or just slightly less than half of your similar size event, just for context. I work for the Bureau of Environmental Services. It's a department. It's the city's sewer and stormwater utility. We have about a $200 million annual budget, which is split approximately in half between operations, O&M, and capital work. And we are funded as an enterprise utility through sewer and stormwater rates. And right now, this number says it's about $60 on average for a resident for those rates. Council just passed the rates for next year, and it's going up 5%. So I'm going to be talking a lot about green streets in Portland. And so this slide gives you just an overview of what green streets look like in general. These are all infiltration facilities. Generally there's no bottom to it, it filtrates right into the native soil. The swales and the planters you see up here are facilities that are built behind the original curb line and the sidewalk. One has more concrete to them. That's the street planters here, and those are seen more in our commercial settings. But in addition, you can see quite a number of curb extensions in our stormwater curb extensions in our city. And these are facilities where the original curb alignment has been moved out into the street by 4 or 6 feet or so, and where water can then go directly from the gutter straight into the stormwater facility. In certain locations, not as many, we have some larger green infiltration facilities, what we call rain gardens. So let me talk a little bit about how we got to this point. As with many programs, you start out with some innovative ideas, at least for your area, we think are pretty neat. And you go through some demonstration projects to see if the ideas actually work out in the field. And so we do a couple of demonstration projects, but then we learned that, if these things are really going to be sticking around, we need to have some support mechanisms, support programs to allow these things to flourish. And so after a little while, more programs came into being internal to the city. And eventually, we got to the point we're so comfortable with it that we started adopting these into our mainstream practices. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So green infrastructure actually started in Portland in the early 1990s as part of the combined sewer overflow program. In our area, we've historically had problems with the combined sewer system, with stormwater and sewer getting into the same pipe, then discharging into the Willamette River. The Willamette River goes straight through the middle of town, and so it's very visible. And so there were notices all the time when there was overflows, and just not a pretty sight. So we started a 20-year, $1.4 billion program to relieve most of those overflows, and I'm happy to say we just finished those. But initially, we started off with some green infrastructure work, downspout disconnections, storm separation, not much green, but even sumps, which infiltrates water into the ground, deep into the ground. But later into the 90s, we started looking at more pilot projects for green streets, some of the ones that you saw up here. And we started doing testing out of our lab with a facility there just to determine how effective these facilities might be as we keep building these. What the Sustainable Stormwater Program did a great job is they continued to do this while monitoring what was happening, and they documented it and reported it. And a lot of those case studies and reports are online, and I'll give you some links to those sites at the end of the presentation. So we were messing around with green street facilities and eco reefs all through the early 90s into the in the early 2000s. So I said the downspout disconnection program was wildly successful early on. It's cheap. We spent maybe $50 per downspout for the residents to disconnect and redirect those spouts onto the lawn, and thus that water is not getting to the combined sewer system anymore, but then infiltrating into a resident's property. And the resident could either disconnect the downspouts, or they can work through our bureau and our contractors to do this. Compared to other measures that we were doing to control combined sewer overflows, far and away, this is the cheapest method. So if you have the right soils in New Orleans or other jurisdictions where you're at, I'd strongly consider doing this. So once we've gotten through a couple of demonstration projects, the next step was really to provide a little bit more background support for these programs. And so the Sustainable Stormwater Program was launched in the early 2000s. And the idea was for them to apply these green infrastructure, green street facilities throughout the city, in pockets of the city where the best opportunities lie. That's important to note that you don't want to jump into an area where you might think there's a need for something, but the residents or the property owners right there aren't excited about it. So we found areas where people are excited about it and there was a need, and thus there was a match made in heaven for green streets. The program management functions include more cost testing and performance testing that, again, is online. Marco mentioned the Green Street Stewards. They're helping with our maintenance work. That's something they're doing currently. The program also works closely with our elected leaders and city council to develop policies, not just for green roofs, which was referenced earlier, but also our green street programs. And it does a lot to form public-private partnerships. Sort of a key piece in the stormwater work is our stormwater management manual. This is, like many jurisdictions, this manual provides the requirements for any developer or for the city for that matter. If they disturb more than 500 square feet of impervious area, then they need to follow the stormwater management controls requirements in order to meet the city's standards. And so what we did is revamped this manual, in the early 2000s to come up with a hierarchy. And the first stage of the hierarchy is to install green infrastructure. And it's up to the applicant or the city to say, well, I know you're supposed to start here, but I can't do it because of X, Y, Z on this property. Otherwise, they're putting in green infrastructure, including green streets. And so now this is sort of the hammer we're using to have green streets installed as well on the right-of-way as well as on private property all across the city. The Graded Green Initiative was mentioned in the introduction. It was started in 2008, and it's City Council's directive to apply some of our budget towards a variety of green works, including green streets, eco roofs, land acquisition for flood control in some of our streams, and even for some culverts where we have problems with fish passage. One of the early partnerships we had was public schools. And public schools has lots of land. In this case, we reconverted a parking lot as part of a middle school into a rain garden. And so now, not only are we providing control of the runoff in that part of the system, but we're also providing an educational lab for the science classes in this middle school. So for several years, the Sustainable Stormwater Program continued to do its good work. They had a lot of successes and convinced really conservative people like me, who's a staunch civil engineer, and say, these things will really work. And I have the performance data, I have the cost data to all make this happen. And they said, okay, well, the design group in our bureau finally relented and said, this is what we should be doing all the time. And so in order to do that, we have to make some adjustments to our standards, whether it's in the planning stage, whether it's design, construction, maintenance, evaluation. Our standards and our practices need to be adjusted a little bit to make sure they recognize green infrastructure as part of our normal operations and our Bureau's mission work. One big program of an example of this mainstreaming is the Tabor to the River program, which I oversee. This is a 1,500-acre program in southeast Portland, about 2¼ square miles. It's mostly residential. It has some commercial districts along Division and Hawthorne, but for the most part, it's residential. And the city had recognized for a long time that there was a fairly high risk of combined sewer backing up into people's basements or onto the streets through manholes, and even in many cases, the pipes were deteriorating. So it's been a problem area for a while for the city. So in 2000, they came up with a solution for that. And this solution included basically separating the combined sewer with the stormwater. So there's over 120,000 linear feet of new sewer pipe that was in this original design, which you see in green up here. But you also see a lot of other colored lines, which indicate that pipe had to be replaced in the sewer system as well, the combined sewer system. So this was about $140 million, $144 million worth of work. But this was just at the point where the demonstration projects for green infrastructure are starting to move forward. Now, in the mid-2000s or so, they asked me and another team to come up with maybe an alternative design that embraces green infrastructure, uses these changes and standards that we've used, and relook at the pre-design. Well, the result is what you see on the screen. It has, it's an $80 million fix, so it's about a $60 million difference. And instead of having 120,000 linear feet of new pipe in there, we have 500 Green Street facilities that we put in here. The green polygons you see up here on the map represent drainage areas to each Green Street in this case. But you also notice that there are a lot of colored lines up here. Green infrastructure does great work, but it's not the solution for everything. And in this case, there's lots of combined sewer system that still needs work, whether the pipes have to be upsized or they just have to be replaced, so they're just too old. But in addition, because we had this green theme to us, we tried to do as much as we could in the right-of-way, but that wasn't enough in some cases. So in very targeted areas, we have identified areas for partnerships with adjacent property owners to manage runoff on their own sites. And that's what you see up here in purple and in dark green. I'll talk a little more about the program. So as this was finished, we rolled out a new project delivery team to complete this work instead of using our traditional CIP team to finish design, construction, and so forth. We tweaked that a little bit. Now we have landscape architects on this group. We have a public involvement specialist, environmental scientists on this group, in addition to folks like me who are engineers and technicians. So the Tabor of the River program has 4 components. One includes capital projects. That's the bulk of the money. There are about 35 different areas within this area, this program area, that consists of all the capital work. What you see up on the screen, the blue areas represent projects that have already been completed, and the green areas are the active projects, either in design or in construction. On the private property side, remember these are just targeted areas, this is not across the basin. On the private property side, we go out and talk individually with residential and commercial properties within a given area and say, listen, we can give you a little bit of money, not a lot, and we can help you with the permitting and some of the other technical pieces of it, and would you be willing to retrofit your own property to allow water from your parking lot or your rooftop to go into this new rain garden. In this case, is a residential rain garden, before and after shot. And the property owner says, sure, that's great, under the best case scenario, sure, that's great. The only thing that you have to do is, the property owner has to do is sign a long-term O&M agreement that says they will maintain this facility because it's partly a public facility. And that agreement is attached to the deed. So regardless of the property owner changes, that piece is still part of the deed. A third piece of the program is vegetation and livability. We love trees in Portland, just like many places in the country. The goal here is to plant 3,500 street trees in this program area. We also have 30 acres of parkland that we want to revegetate and get rid of invasive species, parkland and open space, excuse me. And finally, we recognize the value of having green open space, not only for stormwater purposes, but also for just livability in a neighborhood. And so an example here is we're working with the Planning Bureau and the Transportation Bureau to come up with a little pocket park that takes up an existing street and repurposes it just for a park. One of the biggest pieces of our, at least fundamentally, the biggest parts of our program is public outreach. All of our capital work in the city has a public involvement specialist involved with the project, but this takes it a step higher and says, all right, we have to not only do public outreach on a particular project, what happens next to your house, but across the program area. So the program area-wide continues throughout the 15 years of this program, not just when the projects start and stop. And as all of you know, people learn from different varieties of communication, right? So we use a trailer on a bike sometimes to have a mobile community that we can move around in outdoor settings that shows how eco-roofs and green streets affect neighborhoods. In some cases, we partnered with a local college and photography students to come up with shots of green infrastructure that was done on property. And now we have an art exhibit of stormwater infrastructure. And this exhibit travels from coffee house to grocery stores and other places in the community and stays there for a month or so. And so people see there as you go shopping and say, oh, what's that? And there's a little plaques of what that involved. On the project side, remember that was programmatic. On the project side, we've amped up the outreach a little bit by allowing the adjacent property owners to choose the plants that will go into the Green Street facility. So there's some connection with them to the eventual vegetation in the facility. They don't get to choose anything. That we sort of pre-screen what works well in our facilities, and not only just the plants, but to some degree they're allowed to choose what the design of those plants might look like. So let me talk a little about a couple of recent projects and hopefully some observations from those. The first one is a neighborhood scale project that we worked on in the city, in the program area. And this particular project was only Green Street facilities. That's a little unusual for us since we're partly a sewer bureau. We usually combine Green Streets with sewer as part of a construction package. But in this case, it was all Green Streets. We had a lot of swales that you see on the upper left-hand corner here, as well as curb extensions. And in this case, on the bottom right, for those you can see, there are two curb extensions that are at a corner, but in addition to that, we built out the corner. We pushed the corner out a little bit. So now the pedestrian who's using that corner has a shorter distance to travel from one ramp to the other ramp, which is important, particularly near schools, which is the case in this area. I put in the photo on the far right because I just thought it was funny. Someone decided to put a smiling duck on top of our cast iron grate, which is the overflow of our Green Street facility. And I thought, hey, you know, this is some level of appreciation that the community thinks this is good stuff, right? So this is, at least that's how I interpreted it. Now, whether or not that they did that, I'm gonna go with that theory. So a couple things to think about as you put Green Streets in the right-of-way. There's more than just Green Streets in the right-of-way, right? The street was there first. There are utility poles, there are mailboxes, and there are trees. The trees in particular, I found this interesting. Some tree species just can't handle a lot of extra water that gets infiltrated right next to them. For years and years, decades and decades, the very accustomed to having a little bit of water infiltrate right in that little planting strip. But now the city puts in this infiltration facility, and there's all these gallons of water now. And in some cases, it'll kill the tree. So we work pretty closely with the Urban Forestry Department to see where green streets are appropriate in relation to mature trees. In addition, of course, traffic is on streets. Initially, we didn't put any paint on our curbs, so people started parking there. Like, what? Why are people parking in the travel lane next to a curb extension? This is not what I was considering when I was designing this thing, right? So now, we paint them yellow. So now the parking enforcement arm of the city can go out there and ticket those folks. Unbelievable. So the other thing is, so you're accustomed to driving certain patterns in your own neighborhood, right? For years and years you've done this. But now here's the curb has moved. And if you're out late at night and enjoying life and doing all sorts of things, next morning you can find yourself, your car may be inside this curb extension. And that's what happened in this bottom right-hand corner. The next project I'm going to talk about is the Division Streetscape project. The Transportation Bureau initiated the streetscape concept and finished their concept design in 2005. Our bureau also has an interest, this is part of the TABOR program, has an interest to improve stormwater and watershed goals in this area. So we recognized both of us are doing work in the same area, so we have a joint project now. And the design just finished and just advertised. So the idea here is to combine both ideas. Initially, Division was a 4-lane arterial route. Transportation Bureau decided they're going to cut out 2 lanes and leave those spaces for parking for the commercial district, residential and retail district in that area. But that opened up all sorts of opportunities for green infrastructure in this here. So you can see this light green areas where the stormwater facilities are now will be located in one block, just one block of this 25-block area. And as I said, construction starts this summer, and it will last for about 18 months or so. So the street not only has things on the surface, but of course the subsurface as well. And so for any design, you have to figure out where the utilities are. Green streets are no exception, right? So the green streets are there, and then all of a sudden you realize, there's a gas main right there, or a service line to someone's house. What are we going to do about that? Is it okay if water just travels right past it? And so you have to work with your franchise utilities and partnerships, saying, well, what we're going to do to protect your assets as well as do the work that we want to do. So in some cases, you put a rock gallery. Or in some other cases, you end up putting a plastic liner on the street side to protect a pipe trench that the Water Bureau built. And they don't want stormwater traveling down their trench and compromising their structure. And even after you do all of that work, you start construction, and then, oops, and it's kind of hard to see. Whoop, my bad. But there's a 30-inch steel main there. It was on anyone's records. Maybe that doesn't happen in New Orleans, but it happens in Portland on occasion. And it was like, oh my gosh, 30 inches, that's a big deal. Well, in this case, thankfully, it was abandoned. And so we can just cut right through this thing and put our lead in that we need for the under drain in this case. But yeah, so things like that happen. And so it's a busy place. The right-of-way is a busy place. But there is room when you work with your partners to make sure you can come up with both goals to make sure this happens. Another example is a neighborhood greenway up in northeast Portland. This project just finished construction last week, and this was initiated by our Transportation Bureau to improve bicycle mobility through the city. And so they turned all the stop signs so the bicycles can continue all the way through without stopping, except for the really busy intersections. This was a really cool project. Because we ended up we had, as a sewer and stormwater bureau, we had a similar interest to further our mission work as well. So in the far left here, you can see a curb extension, again with yellow paint, that helps delineate along with the new stripes in the street and the concrete traffic island where bicycles can go and where vehicular traffic can go. This particular intersection was kind of complicated, and there were a lot of accidents between bicycles and cars here, so it was a big improvement, we think, for safety purposes. The center image is a block that the transportation blocked off for vehicular traffic. No cars or trucks can go through there anymore except for emergency vehicles. And it's right next to a school. Bicycles and pedestrians can continue going through. But we tore up the road and changed the road so everything shed to one side. So from the way you're viewing it, from the right, all the water drains to the left side where there's a curb extension, and the water drains and infiltrates into that curb extension. The last one, I think, is the best, and that's because I'm an engineer. But the reason is that it's a rain garden in an area where they've narrowed the street a little bit, so the cars slow down a little, and a little bit safer for bicycles. But I don't know if you can tell, but there's two little pedestrian bridges right here, and which allows people to go from the sidewalk into the grassy median that's right there. These pedestrian bridges were taken from extra segments of our 22-foot CSO tunnel. We have extras on hand, not a lot, but a couple extra on hand, and now we're using them as pedestrian bridges, and we flipped them upside down and use them as pedestrian bridges, and we're going to put an interpretive sign so people can make the link between the big CSO tunnel and what the purpose of a rain garden is, which is all about. In our city, the message is clean the Willamette, clean the Willamette. And so this hopefully is another step towards that piece. One thing I didn't mention during the public outreach slide is consistent messaging is the key, right? For us, it's clean rivers, clean Willamette. Y'all's might be something like flooding protection to some degree. Something that people can easily recognize. In this case, we had a project where we were pretty focused on what's happening in the project area, but not necessarily what's happening 2, 3, 4 blocks away, which was a bad thing to do, at least initially in design, until some of the older residents and someone else in our group identified that this area used to be an agricultural land, and there was a farm pond 3, 4 blocks away. And so we started talking to people who had property on where that farm pond is, and sure enough, in the wintertime when it rains a lot in Portland, their backyard is basically a sponge, right? So they're already having problems with high groundwater. And so putting Green Street facilities just up the hill there, not a good idea, right? So even geologically, you can make the argument that the water up there won't get to that point. There's a perception issue. Right, so we just decided to get rid of the Green Street facilities in that particular area, those couple blocks. The rest of the facilities in the project stayed. Finally, probably one of the most challenging projects I've seen to date, and that's putting green infrastructure in a freight district. And usually we put these in residential areas. There are parking issues there, and that's an inconvenience, but in a freight district, that's a big deal because you have trucks moving, you have parking problems. There's a concept design that includes some artwork that was finished in 2010, and some initial projects started. But this was a bear to design. We actually had to go through each intersection, interview all of the businesses and say what type of trucks, how big are the trucks you use to deliver products to your stores, and then do some design work to find out how those trucks turn. So we know we don't want the trailers of those trucks dumping into the Green Street facility, kind of like that car did a couple slides ago. And so the curbs here have kind of funky design to them, but they follow the end of the trailer of these trucks, and that's the whole purpose of them. There are some parking issues here, and so we had to basically negotiate with the business owners to find out where's parking really critical and where it's not, and we end up only losing 9 spaces out of a 12-block area. So in conclusion, Portland's been doing Green Street and green infrastructure work for a while. In the early 1990s, we started our CSO program. That was the driver early on. Like anything, you should start with pilots or case studies and demonstration projects that will lead you into more sophisticated work where you need more support systems, and eventually it will lead you into mainstreaming your practices. And you should always look at, all of you know this now, the green infrastructure and green streets have lots of benefits to them. Identify those early and find out who the potential partners are. Those are good funding sources for some of your work. And with that, I believe some of this will be online, so you don't have to write down all these crazy links on here, but there's more information online for you to peruse at your leisure. With that, I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that other communities follow the Foundation's work here, because this is a great thing to do to initiate dialogue here. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Bill, and please hold your questions till the end, because right now we have Karen Sands, who will tell us a little bit about what Milwaukee has been up to.
So Marco mentioned my travel issues today. I have travel issues every time I travel. It's really me. And I was thinking how we often follow in the footsteps of Portland. And in, September 10th, 2001, I was actually in Portland learning about their green roof program. And you can imagine my travel issues on that date. So, but it is true. We do look to Portland as an example. They started green infrastructure programs, demonstration projects, much earlier than we did. At the time when they started, we were actually working on a lot of gray infrastructure projects, which is also very important to us, a point that Marco made, and I just would reiterate Bill, what Bill said, there are a lot of parallels to what's happening and has happened in Milwaukee. So the picture on the left is a picture of a green roof, and we consider green roofs or roofs in general to really be the headwaters of our watersheds. What falls on the roof eventually ends up down the street, eventually goes into our area waterways, and all too often into our sanitary sewers instead. In Milwaukee and in many other places, we are interested in green infrastructure to protect receiving water quality. In this case, on the right-hand side is Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is one of the Great Lakes, obviously, and together with the other Great Lakes holds 20% of the world's freshwater resources. It's a treat to live where we live, and it's something that residents, and myself included, take for granted all too often. But green infrastructure really helps bring us back, because it's a constant reminder of our need, whenever we see it, our need to protect the receiving water into which it flows. So I'm going to talk very similarly to what Bill talked about, a little bit of background about the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District where I work, a little bit about some of our programs, some demonstration projects that help illustrate things that you may do or may be doing already, and then I think we'll take questions jointly together. On the top, the picture is a pretty good illustration of why it's important to manage out-of-bank flooding. Too much water has gotten into this river, the Kinnickinnic River, and obviously it's hitting this bridge. It didn't take it out in this particular storm, but it worried a lot of people. And then the bottom is just a picture of some gas spheres that we have at one of our wastewater treatment plants. We collect methane, and that meets about half of the energy needs at that plant. So we do a lot of other things besides just working on green infrastructure. So I'm going to spend a little time on this map. It's a map of the region in southeastern Wisconsin covered by MMSD, where I work. North is at the top. On the right is Lake Michigan. The city of Milwaukee is one of 28 municipalities we serve. It's about 25% of our area, though, so it's very, very important to us. We serve a little over 1 million customers, and our entire planning area is 411 square miles. Our service area is a subset of that, somewhere on the order of 370 square miles or so. We're at the downstream end of what happens in those 28 municipalities. Most of our area has separate storm and sanitary sewers, except for that sort of orange-brown hatched area you see right in the center on the right-hand side. That's a combined sewer system at the downstream receiving end of much of the region, but not all of it. The combined sewer service area is about 6% of our region, and their stormwater and sanitary is mixed. And that's also the older part of the city. It's also the downtown area where buildings were plumbed specifically for combined sewers, and so to separate the sewers would really be a major undertaking. In the rest of the region, that other 94%, in most of our communities, we have separate sewers. So a system for stormwater, and that stormwater typically goes to area waterways completely untreated. So you can see how green infrastructure might be a benefit there. And then sanitary sewers that flow from buildings, whether privately or publicly owned, out into the system in the street, and those are owned and operated by municipalities, and that eventually flows down to where I work, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. So we just own the bottom trunk of the system, about 300 miles. So you might ask why we're interested in green infrastructure, because it's completely, or at least physically, disconnected from our system. In the combined area, though, we really want to reduce the amount of clear water that we have to treat, so green infrastructure is a great way to hold it. In the separate area, we know that Milwaukee's an older place, pipes leak, and stormwater leaks into sanitary sewers, unfortunately. You know, if everything was perfectly tight, our dry weather and our wet weather flows would be the same, or, you know, give or take, but they're not. In fact, in some areas, there's a ratio as high as 25-1. So those are areas where water is getting in, either, you know, by mistake or leaking in to the sanitary where it shouldn't, and that overwhelms the system. Our public demands zero overflows and zero basement backups. That's pretty much unheard of. We've been able to get that way, way down to within our permit. We have less than 3 overflows a year. Those are overflow events. And that's pretty good, but it's still not zero. In fact, it happens so infrequently that when it happens, it's a news story, which you know, is a management issue for staff. It's very, very important for us to therefore continue to work on getting overflows to zero. We think that green infrastructure is a piece of the puzzle to getting to zero. We also have to work on private property inflow and infiltration issues. We haven't, you know, always need to look at capacity issues, but green infrastructure is a really important piece that can't be ignored, and it provides many, many other benefits. So we have a very large collection system. We have 2 water reclamation facilities that on a dry day may each treat about 70 million gallons, and on a wet day they can ramp up to 300 million gallons each or more. We also have an extensive tunnel system. You heard Marco mention that. It's, we call it the deep tunnel. That's the easy name for it, but it's both inline and remote storage that totals 521 million gallons. And we reserve that for when we're having really big storms and the amount of water coming into the system that would go to the plants might overwhelm the capacity. So we temporarily store that water. It's either sewer water or combined sewer and sanitary. And we store that in the tunnel until the system can catch up and take care of it. There are times, though, you know, a little bit less than 3 times a year where even that's not enough. So we're looking to figure out how green infrastructure capacity can help us. We are in the process of finishing up a green infrastructure plan that has a capacity, all told, of 740 million gallons, which is really an extraordinary amount of capacity per event. It would be larger than our tunnel system, it would be costly, and it would be a culture change. To me, it's very, very exciting because I think it will essentially green the region, not only helping us handle stormwater better, but really changing everything. We have looked at, for instance, property value impacts of green infrastructure. We see increasing property values. We see all kinds of quality of life issues, reduced urban heat island impacts, all kinds of things. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here with my excitement about it. So with all the gray infrastructure that we've done, we have really, really reduced overflows significantly. We used to have 40 to 60 events per year. Now we're down to just less than 3. As a result, the Milwaukee River, as well as the Menominee River and the Kinnickinnick River, all of which coalesce in downtown Milwaukee, have really, really become much cleaner. Instead of businesses turning their backs to the waterways, now all kinds of restaurants and bars and outside walking paths have sprung up. Our river walk is pretty famous. There's actually a statue of the Fonz along it, so if you ever want to visit, Marco was right, it's the home of the Fonz in Laverne and Shirley. But it's really kind of a fun happening downtown now, where we wouldn't have seen this 20 years ago, and it's because of the gray infrastructure investments that have been made that this can happen. But it's still not enough. So we had to do this gray infrastructure work. It was required, you know, as part of some court decisions. But we also want to top it off with green. So that's my corny moment there. I'm not an artist. Uh-oh. It's not going away. So Our approach to green infrastructure is both including carrots and sticks, and I think that you really need both. You know, we have state regulations that take care of polluted stormwater runoff, you know, with MS4 permits. At MMSD, we have what we call our Chapter 13 rules, and those are focused on water quality. And we want to, or quantity rather, and we want to supplement what's required by the state to look at water quantity so that flood management facilities that we build aren't overwhelmed, so that out-of-bank flooding then doesn't pour into our system and surcharge it. We want to make sure that the capacity of what we build and maintain is fine into the future. And so the Chapter 13 rules affect new and redevelopment of at least a half an acre or greater. And when a development like that comes before us, then we have a series of hierarchical things that need to be looked at to get to pre-development runoff rates. First on our hierarchy, just like Portland, is green infrastructure, unless or until a developer says, I can't do it with green, and then we look at other measures going down the list, but we prefer green infrastructure. We also are working with 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin, who's the lead on a project, to review municipal codes and ordinances to make sure that there aren't barriers to green infrastructure. So because a lot of what happens at the municipal level, we don't have any direct control over unless we make a rule, we rely, in this case, on others. And so this code and ordinance review is looking for barriers, things like, you know, if you have porous pavement, is a top seal coat required? You know, that would be something that would render it not porous, so you wouldn't want that. We also really heavily rely on education and information. We have a website for green infrastructure. It's called h2ocapture.com that I'll show you a page on. And then it's also important that whenever we hear something in the public or from our municipalities about why green infrastructure won't work, that we go and sort of look at this in terms of, you know, can we bust this myth or not? So one was property values. There were studies all across the United States that showed green infrastructure has a positive correlation with rising property values. So we worked with UWM, or University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Center for Economic Development, and they did a study for us that has shown that, yes, indeed, even in Milwaukee, there are very positive correlations between green infrastructure and higher property values. We've also looked at calculating the triple bottom line impacts of green infrastructure. So if somebody's not interested in stormwater management, maybe they care about something else. And we can find that value, whether it's social, economic, or environmental, within that analysis and present the case for green infrastructure that way to them. And then to support all of this, we have a number of programs that are the carrots, really. We have a rain barrel sale program. I'll actually talk about each of these as we go forward. So this is our public information site, h2ocapture.com. There are a number of tools on it. There's a mapping tool so you can go locate your green infrastructure feature. There's basic information. There's more detailed information for designers. We try to rotate content, but we have trouble with that because, you know, it's a staffing issue. But we think we have a way around that. Others in the region now are interested in green infrastructure. There are lots of potential partners, and they're interested in partnering on this website, which to me is just a great thing because we should be working together as a region on this. You know, it's not just MMSD or it's not just the city of Milwaukee, but it's really everybody, whether they're a unit of government, a non-governmental organization, or an individual private property owner. So our first program I wanted to talk about is our rain barrel program. It's perhaps the most mature rain barrel program in the country. It's well over 10 years old. We've placed over 18,000 rain barrels in the region. That equates per storm to over 1 million gallons, assuming people empty their rain barrels, which isn't always a good assumption. I'm a gardener. I like to hoard my water. I think a lot of other gardeners do. So in terms of relying on rain barrels, you know, as a key piece of your program, probably not for capacity. However, for education and outreach, they're the perfect tool because I like to think of them as the gateway drug to better stormwater management. Once you get a rain barrel, you hook it up to your house, and then it rains, and you go out with your umbrella, and you watch it, and then it overflows in 10 minutes. And people are astounded that it overflows in 10 minutes. And if it rains for a few more hours, it's a really good illustration of how much water we are contending with at the downstream end. And how many rain barrels, people start to think, well, how many rain barrels would I need on my house? And, often the answer is, you couldn't retrofit enough rain barrels on your house. It's a lot of rain that falls in these significant events. And then people start to think, well, what else could I do? Could I, make my patio smaller? Could I make it porous? Could I install a rain garden? And it really starts to take on a life of its own with some people who become interested in it. And one of the ways that we get to massive amounts of people is through schools. Bill mentioned working with schools. I think schools are an important avenue for this, and so oftentimes we will donate, even 5 rain barrels to a whole school, and the kids will paint them in art class. They'll calculate the capacity in math class. They'll do a across the curriculum analysis of them, and then they'll sometimes have a silent auction, and they often go for more than $100 each. It's really just amazing. And when you do that, you've hit not only the hundreds of kids in the schools, but then all of their parents and sometimes their grandparents too, with the message of rain barrels. So I think rain barrels are really terrific. You won't get all your capacity from them, but you might get a big chunk of your education and outreach. Our rain barrels, too, are reclaimed pickle and food grade syrup type barrels from local food manufacturers. So they might have otherwise have ended up in a landfill, and they're retrofitted by the Milwaukee Community Service Corps, so it's also a job training program. And I can't take responsibility for this. It's other people at my organization, but I think it's just terrific. So another program that we have for the do-it-yourselfer is our rain garden program. We have worked with the Graham Martin Foundation since 2006. They're the foundation arm of a company called Agricol, and they provide rain garden plants at about half price. So homeowners are putting some money into this when they buy rain garden plants, but they are a bargain and they're great plants. So we have an annual sale that's conducted online. All we do is staff it, and the plants show up once a year in our parking lot, so people who order, they know to come down to our building and pick up their plants. Green roofs, this is the one we modeled after Portland, and I think we still look to Portland for guidance on how this works. We are at the point where we subsidize green roofs to the point of about $5 a square foot. Green roofs that have been submitted to us for consideration have ranged as low as $7 a square foot total to over $40 a square foot. So whether they're, extensive, the more thin kind, or intensive, the deeper kind, there's a wide range of costs. But our subsidy remains at $5 a square foot. Chicago's really well known for their green roof program too. They've mandated it. Ours is more voluntary. And it's interesting, our early green roofs tended to be more public sector folks, and as the program has matured, we have a lot of private sector interest. People looking to build a green brand for their building. People looking to save money on heating and cooling costs in the floor right below the green roof. So the private sector is really starting to catch on and think in terms of a long-term investment rather than the short-term additional cost. Couple more green roofs I just want to point out. These are, the Clock Shadow Building one on the top, that's in a mixed-use neighborhood that includes some residential. It's actually an urban ag demonstration on a roof, and they also have traditional roof trays. They catch the rainwater on the roof and use it to water the food, and the food is sold at a farmer's market on the roof. And then the other one, Rockwell International, is the largest green roof in the state of Wisconsin. It's about an acre large. And it has all kinds of super duper, the Cadillac of monitoring equipment on it. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the city of Milwaukee's porous alleys. They've started to experiment with putting a porous strip down the middle of an alley. Instead of crowning it, it's depressed in the middle. The open graded stone spans the entire width of the alley, but it's just an 18-inch strip down the middle that's actually porous, so the water goes in and then spreads out. This is on property owned by the City of Milwaukee Housing Authority, who's been a great champion of green infrastructure. Who knew, but actually the Housing Authority is taking the lead on a lot of green infrastructure. They were some of the first green roofs in Milwaukee have been put on public housing projects, and more recently, they've done an extensive project with bioswales at a new housing establishment. So looking at opportunities for porous alleys and other green streets is now, just as of a couple months ago, standard operating procedure for the city of Milwaukee. They have a Green Street standard that has an SOP for Department of Public Works and others with a process, and each step of the way, especially in the beginning of a street redo, they look at green infrastructure, and not just porous pavement, but also street trees, bioswales, what have you. And so I've got a couple pictures of bioswales. In Milwaukee, we have a thin layer of topsoil with a lot of clay. So we have to bioengineer the soils. We also have to provide an underdrain because during a big storm, those bioswales tend to fill up and get trapped in the clay. So our design may be a little bit different than Portland's, but again, every situation is unique, and you would do what's right in New Orleans, I'm sure. Let's see. An example of a green street in Milwaukee is the South Street, 6th Street corridor. And this is really interesting to me. As a planner, I'm used to, having a big scoping session and figuring everything out systematically, and plans sometimes take years. But this was great because an alderman, the alderman for this area, decided that this was going to be a green street, and he worked with staff, and the Common Council declared this was going to be a green street, and it's organically growing as a recognized green street, not just for green stormwater practices, but for, I would almost call it a complete street. It has other features as well. Urban ag is a big piece of it. There had been an urban garden there for a number of years, and they installed an aquablock system that captures runoff and stores it underground. There's a solar pump that pumps it out when people want to use it. There's also a residential neighborhood called the Garden District, where modest, average-size homes have beautifully landscaped lawns, or they tend to, and people have a real pride in their rain gardens and the sense that they've developed about green infrastructure. In fact, that neighborhood association got together and made a major purchase in the rain garden plant program this year, and so then they get together and do massive plantings. It's a really nice fit that just kind of grew. This is a project in an inner ring suburb of Milwaukee it's in Shorewood, Wisconsin. Houses are fairly dense, lots of bungalows, 1920s, 1930s type development. There were a lot of basement backups occurring in this one particular neighborhood, and it happens to be on the edge of the combined sewer system. Looking at the solution, initially the solution looked like it needed to be upsizing a pipe in the street so that the stormwater, more stormwater could get into it and get away and not wreak havoc in people's basements. Instead, we looked at doing green infrastructure, a number of downspout disconnections. We did 985 on 241 homes. And then, in some cases, putting a rain barrel on the end of the downspout disconnection and a rain garden. So we basically disconnected rooftops from the combined sewer service area. Did it work? So what you're looking at here is most of Shorewood, Wisconsin. It's only a square mile. It's very small. The little sort of dot features you see are locations from our H2O Capture website of where rain gardens and rain barrows are located. So you can kind of see a cluster. Let's see if I remember how to do this. Nope. We'll go up this way. I'm going to just walk over and point. Old-fashioned way. So right here is where you're looking. There are a lot of symbols there, meaning there are a lot of rain barrels and rain gardens that we helped in, the city of Shorewood took the lead, but we helped finance it. Those were installed prior to July 2010, which is the color data that you're seeing. So we record basement backup calls, or wet basements, basically. And where you see red, there's a large cluster of calls, or a dense cluster of calls. Where you see orange, less dense, yellow, less dense, green, only a few. And where you see no color, there really were no calls. Now, what you can see in this example is that widespread green infrastructure seems to correspond with no basement backup calls, where previously that was, a frequent caller type neighborhood. So does this mean it fixed the problem? Not necessarily, but I think it's a good demonstration that it can. It's a no-risk solution, green infrastructure that is. So why not try it? You might get this great result. Menominee Valley is a great example of an economic development project that's sandwiched between neighborhoods. At the turn of the century, the Menominee Valley was known as the breadbasket of America. There were like dozens of train lines that went through, delivering wheat from the Midwest back east. It was a hopping place, and people from the adjacent neighborhoods would walk to their jobs, and there were all kinds of connections down into the valley. Well, with the deindustrialization of the U.S. and recognition of brownfield issues and a number of other things, the Menominee Valley fell on hard times, and by the late 1990s, there wasn't a lot of business left down there. It was an abandoned area, like you see at the top. There weren't a lot of connections to get there. You know, I've talked to some people, they were like, I don't even know how to get there. And things have changed. And they've changed because, well, there were a number of steps that led to this change. But to me, the primary driver for change was investment in infrastructure that lured businesses back. And it wasn't just in streets and power and whatever else you might need. Major investments were made in stormwater management, and not traditional stormwater management, green infrastructure like you see on the bottom here. That's an overlook. This is all right here, like a giant bioretention area, dozens and dozens of acres. The city set that aside for green stormwater management. That attracted the development of the Hank Aaron State Trail, and really an aesthetic blossoming of the whole valley. As a result, I'm not sure of the percentage utilization, but it's mostly built out. It's with more light industrial work. Thousands of people are employed again in the valley, and the connections to the surrounding neighborhoods so that workers can again walk to their jobs or bike to their jobs, those connections have been reestablished. To me, that was all drawn by this really unique investment in green infrastructure in the valley. And you can't talk about Milwaukee without talking about beer, so here's the obligatory beer slide. Pabst, you've probably heard of Pabst, is no longer at the, where it used to be made. And so there were beautiful Cream City brick buildings at the brewery. And the developer decided that to also make it a showcase for green infrastructure. But it's very, very dense and very, very hardscape and right next to downtown Milwaukee. So having that, dozens and dozens of acres of bioretention, like you saw on the last slide, probably wouldn't work here. So this green infrastructure has much more of an urban feel. And again, to me, it's just another illustration of each site is really unique, and you need to think about, what's contextually appropriate and can still be done in a green way. As a result of, again, the investments in green infrastructure here, there have been a number of businesses, NGO offices, the Zilber School of Public Health has moved in there, and there are some residential units as well. So it's a really nice mixed-use development that, again, was spurred by green infrastructure investments. Almost done. So why are we interested in green infrastructure? And this isn't yet up on the slide, but we have a brand new 2035 vision that helps us think toward the future. You think back 25 years ago, I didn't have a cell phone. I think I had a calculator, probably not much else. I think I got up to turn the dial on the TV. Things have changed significantly in 25 years, and we need to think, when we make infrastructure investments, what do we need in not only in 25 years, but in 50 years or in 75 years? Things will be very, very different. So we think that green infrastructure is one of those things that will stand the test of time. If our climate changes and we have more severe storms and we need bigger pipes, that's a big investment. But the investment we make on the surface of the land in green infrastructure is something that will always be there as long as we maintain it, and it will always provide not only a stormwater benefit, but all the other benefits that we've talked about. The mayor of Milwaukee is currently the chair of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Mayors Group, and they're very, very big on green infrastructure. Our executive director at MMSD is also sort of a green infrastructure action superhero. But most importantly now, we have a brand new discharge permit. It's the first in the country of this type. We, in the past, have been meeting our discharge permit. And so we don't have a consent decree. We don't have a requirement to do green infrastructure like many other communities across the United States have. So we have now, as written into our permit, this need to add 1 million gallons of new capacity annually. So it's a permit requirement that I do my job, which is really terrific. And it's not just terrific, for me, but it's terrific for the region because all of these other benefits will emanate from widespread green infrastructure, which in turn just will make Milwaukee a much better place to live. It's already a good place to live. So in the world that I work in, really every drop does count because the drops add up, and every drop of polluted stormwater runoff that we keep out of Lake Michigan keeps it looking like this and keeps it out of our basements. So, there.
Right, thank you so much to both Bill and Karen. These are really illuminating presentations, and we thank you very much. So our council member, our celebrity co-moderator could not be here, unfortunately, but I will try to carry the load. I just had a couple of questions before we go into the audience and ask and seek you out with a microphone. And Julia, we have a microphone for them for that purpose. Just a couple of questions. We had, I thought I saw David Wagner come into the room earlier on as we began, and there he is, has often talked about the fact that, the improvements that we're talking about, the stormwater improvements, the holding water in place strategies, actually enhance, as you were talking about just a minute ago, Karen, property values. And I was wondering if you had come up with a formula for that. And the same thing goes for Bill, actually, in Portland. Certainly there are traffic calming measures that come with the kinds of curb water storm extensions, the bump outs that you were talking about. Have you collected any data on that in terms of traffic calming measures or reduction in accidents, things like that? And then, of course, the actual enhancement of property values.
So that's a really tough question. Is this on? Yeah. No, we haven't, because each situation is so unique. One of the areas that we looked at, the Shorewood, Wisconsin example, in terms of property values, there really wasn't a positive correlation. We don't know if it's because, there wasn't a negative correlation either. There just wasn't a correlation. That was already a well-to-do area with relatively high property values, so maybe that was a factor. In other areas, we saw a really significant rise, particularly where property values weren't so high, so maybe it was a factor. To me, we had to hire an expert to do the work, first of all, and they did a regression analysis, which is something I haven't looked at since, college.
Gotcha.
So the short answer is no, we don't have a formula for it. I think it's very, very local and very unique. And if you were going to do something like that here, you should hire local people to do it.
Okay.
So we have not collected data to address traffic accidents and other things that you mentioned. We have, however, participated in a study that some economists in the Pacific Northwest simply looked at in Seattle that dealt with aesthetics and property values when green street facilities are built in neighborhoods. And they did, I can't remember, it was a heuristic analysis of neighborhoods that had green street facilities and those close by that did not have, and then looked at property turnover and crunched the numbers. And the long and short of it is there's some value, but it's not 10-20% increase in your property values. They're looking at 3-5% increase.
Okay.
But there is, I have my fingertips at that study back at my office, but so that's the only one I can think of.
Okay, well, thank you. I thought I saw a question in the audience. Maybe we can get a microphone.
To the question about property values, would not flood insurance or property insurance have some correlation to stormwater management or flooding? Would that be a number that could be used as well?
We could talk to our economist. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I don't have specific data about that, I'm afraid.
So,
A lot of things were controlled for in the analysis, so I'm not sure if they controlled for that, but it's possible.
one other thing that I'd like to ask you before I turn it over completely to the rest of you is the Thousand Friends of Wisconsin that you would use to actually look at existing regs within the city municipal codes and ordinances that were impediments to implementing the kind of green infrastructure you were talking about. We in the city of New Orleans actually, it's illegal still to install cisterns in the city of New Orleans because of the ancient, well, almost ancient now, fear of yellow fever. So how did you do that? How did you go about doing that? It seems that community outreach is a hugely important part of what you do. And what brought that about? How did you actually get that going?
Well, that's a long story that I'll make short. So we did an analysis with the Center for Watershed Protection of codes and ordinances barriers back in 2005 and 6. And we provided the data to municipal engineers, and they said, thank you very much. And I'm not sure many of the changes were made, except in the case of the city of Milwaukee, where much was changed, thanks to a staff person that worked at MMSD. So the science has evolved. We talked to another consultant about it. We knew that we needed to not only look at the codes and ordinances themselves, but look at the context within which they sit, and then help municipalities to make those changes. And it just so happened that 1,000 Friends of Wisconsin got a grant from the Fund for Lake Michigan to do the work. And so it made more sense for us to support that NGO rather than to lead it. So I see a much stronger outcome this time around. And then specific to your question about cisterns, cisterns are also very difficult in Wisconsin. It has to do with the state plumbing code. Basically, if you catch rainwater and want to reuse it from a cistern for any purpose, even lawn watering, from what I understand, it has to be clean to drinking water standards, which is sort of a deterrent to
Yeah.
installing a cistern. So we have our own barriers in state plumbing code to overcome still.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the audience? Other ones? Yes.
New Orleans is working on rewriting Chapter 26, which is our blight. It's what's been used to work blight. But there's a specific section in it that says drainage. And I just wanted to read it. Drainage from roofs, paved areas, yards, courtyards, and other open areas shall not pool to permit stagnant water likely to afford a breeding place for mosquitoes or become contaminated or polluted in such a manner as to injure the public health or create offensive conditions. Which, okay, fine, motherhood and apple pie. Approved retention areas and reservoirs are exempt from this section, so okay, they know that there's a need to have retention areas. And it's this last two sentences that kind of made my hair stand on end. It said, drainage systems shall divert water away from the property and away from adjacent property lines. All drainage should discharge towards the public right-of-way. And I was just wondering, with your experience, whether or not you thought that was potentially the best way to go about saying that sort of thing in a new ordinance.
Okay, thanks. So I'll give you my opinion. Our downspout program is an example of a situation where we allow water to drain onto the property. There are rules about how much space is allowed. If the drainage setback requirements, basically, you can't disconnect your downspouts and then have it drain to your neighbor's lawn. That's a bad thing. So our code isn't quite this strict, but generally lots are drained towards the right-of-way anyway, just because that's how the sites are set up. But we don't, in Portland, we don't quite go to this level. We allow drainage onto property.
And I'm not an expert on City of Milwaukee codes, but I would say we have the same issue with draining to a neighbor's lot line. You want to be careful not to, send stormwater into their foundation. And so every site is looked at uniquely. And I think green infrastructure could still drain toward the public right-of-way, but it, can be designed to certainly slow it down. So you're also delaying the timing of when it reaches the street, and then delaying the volume that ends up in the street.
Who else? Yeah.
So since both of you have pretty established GI programs, I'm curious, have y'all done any cost analysis of how green infrastructure, O&M, compares to gray infrastructure, O&M, especially lifespan of gray infrastructure, the replacement cost, which you're probably not there yet, but you probably are looking out at that in the future?
I'll start. The short answer is yes, we have. There's no question that green infrastructure is more costly to maintain than to maintain a pipe. And so you have to know that up front going into your design and when you're constructing it. Our oldest facility was built in 2003. Green Street facility is built in 2003, so it hasn't gone to its lifespan yet. So a lot of it is speculation. We do a 100-year life cycle cost analysis for all of our capital projects now to identify whether green infrastructure is the right route to go or the traditional pipe route is. And included in that are the maintenance costs. And that is an ongoing debate within our Bureau of how much green is still worth it. While our capital dollars are bonded, and so you'll get into this apparently in the next workshop. So the financing gets a little complicated. So the color of money actually makes a difference in operating costs rather than a capital cost. So that hasn't slowed us down too much yet to build green infrastructure, but something we're looking into.
Ditto. So, these 28 municipalities that are within our area, we meet with them monthly. We call it a technical advisory team meeting, and it's the chief engineers or public works directors that show up for the meeting, and that's the thing I hear about the most. First the capital outlay, but then how are we going to afford to maintain it? And that's something that we need to figure out how to tackle. If I stand up in front of them and say, yeah, but think of the benefits, and you can net the O&M costs against the benefits and the costs don't all go in the same pocket, is what it boils down to. There are, tremendous benefits with green infrastructure, but we still need to figure out the financing, what is that formula?
I saw a question here.
I'm curious if either of your cities have considered separating the gray water in a home or in any building from the sewage water so that the gray water could be used in some other kind of fashion.
The plumbing code is an issue that would need to be overcome. The other issue would be cost effectiveness, because it would be more expensive to build a dual system. In Milwaukee, water is extremely plentiful. Right outside the door is 20% of the world's fresh water in the Great Lakes. Our water rates tend to be, pretty low. So there's not that incentive. It's not something that's either tremendously expensive or very, very, very dear. It's cheap and it's there. So there have been talk about demonstration projects, and there are some installations of rainwater used to flush toilets, occasionally, but it's more of a demonstration project than anything that has become widespread yet.
So I'll second her comments. Our plumbing code in the state of Oregon has similar challenges. We do have examples throughout our city of capturing rainwater from roofs and going into a cistern, and then that can be used for either landscaping or for toilets or things of non-potable use. But beyond that, we don't have any gray water systems.
Who else? Anyone else in the audience? So I have a question about rain barrels, actually. I'll get to you in just a minute. How does it work in Milwaukee in this case.
You were talking about the fact that there's a certain fee that's charged, right? And you get the barrels in question from companies and supermarkets and places like that. Do you have to pay anything for them, or are they donated? How does that work? And then do you provide technical assistance when it comes to redirecting downspouts and basically telling people how to maximize use of the water that's collected in those barrels?
So when we started the program, we got the rain barrels for free because they were going into a landfill anyway. Once people caught on that these might have some value and we were frantically, looking for sources of enough rain barrels to meet demand, we sometimes started getting charged for them, but not significant amount of money. So with our barrels and the fee to the Community Service Corps for retrofitting them and then all the parts, we sell them for $49.95, and that's really at cost. We don't make anything on it, but we're not looking to make any money. We're looking to put rain barrels out there, so that's okay. In terms of technical assistance, we've always had directions with the rain barrel. We've always had directions on our website. Just actually today, we released two how-to videos, one how to finish off your barrel and one how to install it. So you can go on our website and take a look at it. It's brand new.
Great, thank you.
I saw a question over here.
In New Orleans, we have something called the Mosquito Control Board because we have a problem with mosquitoes. And so on the public spaces where you have, where you've captured water, how big a cost is there associated with increased spraying or those kinds of insect control?
As far as I know, zero. And our facilities are designed to drain within 48 hours. If they do not drain within 48 hours, it's a flaw in the design. And we will go back and retrofit the facility, put in a perf pipe if necessary, in order for that drainage to occur. They are supposed to pond. We want them to pond, but only for a short amount of time. At least in our area, our county health department has said 48 hours is the maximum time that water can stand without more mosquitoes, creating a mosquito habitat. So that's our criteria.
Who else?
Just one other thing. So you should check this, but maybe 10 years ago, a coworker and I wrote a paper on rain barrels, and one of the items that was shown that could be an issue is mosquitoes. And so the life cycle of the mosquito larvae, I believe, was like 7 to 9 days. And so we always recommended that people empty their rain barrels before 7 days, and or that they screen both the intake and the outgo on the barrel so that mosquitoes wouldn't fly in. When we did the research at the time, West Nile virus was a really big deal. And so we had some really grave concerns that we think we could deal with in terms of both a design issue and how do we operate the barrel. And I think that would apply to other types of green infrastructure too. Just make sure that it's emptied or designed to drain shorter than the life cycle of that mosquito larvae.
I know that you're all brimming with questions. Don't hesitate to raise your hands. Both 2 hands means you're very enthusiastic. So, oh yes, sorry.
Two questions. The first one is a regional question. In talking about the backing up of basements, what is a basement? And the second one, though, more pertains to the setting up of a gray water system or a rain system where you would actually store water for watering your lawns or your plants for later on. You were mentioning that there are regulations which state in Milwaukee that you have to have it to drinking standards. Do you find that these regulations are actually strictly enforced, or are they just old laws that are on the books that people can easily overturn them? I'm also curious about the yellow fever around here, because I'm actually looking at doing some projects here where I would be setting up a gray water system in houses that are being rebuilt.
A basement is a thing I wish I didn't have because it gets wet. In terms of gray water reuse and the installation of cisterns, I know of a couple people who wanted to install a cistern. And because the regulations they haven't been used much. You have to get a permit to have it installed, and it has to be inspected. And I know it went from the city to the state. People scratch their heads, and I don't know exactly on what level it is, but after 6 months, I know of at least 2 projects that one decided not to move forward and the other decided to install it and not talk about it. So I think that they're enforced in that, whether it's the paperwork or the process is very difficult. I don't know that anybody has ever gone to jail for installing a cistern, because I don't think there are too many of them, and if there are, we don't know about all of them.
All right, anyone else? Yes.
Hi, we have a green business certification program here in New Orleans, so we encourage our businesses to break laws all the time. But I know that a lot of these issues, like stormwater management, are collective issues where, like you said, certain costs and certain benefits don't always fall into the same party, but are really about the benefit of the group. And it's often really difficult when we're talking to government and business and homeowners to get everyone to see the benefit of the group and not always care about their own self-interests. So how do you, in this process in both of your cities, create a common vision where you get a group of multi-stakeholders to come together and say, this matters for our community together collectively, and what's your best strategy for making that case?
So I tried to allude that in my presentation. We find something that resonates with a large group of people. In our city, it's the Willamette River. Similar, apparently, with the river in downtown Milwaukee, it's a place where people can congregate. I think there's actually a triathlon now that uses the Willamette as well. But keeping the Willamette clean, creating a treasure for the community is something that, at least in our city, people resonate with and want to see happen. And so even though you live 3 miles away from the river, we can make the argument that the pipe system is such that if you do work on your own property and your neighbor does, and your neighbor 3 blocks away does that, then it helps the Willamette. Oddly enough, the basement backup, the sewer backup problem isn't a driver. It's a nasty thing to think about, but it happens so infrequently in some parts of the city. That's not enough. So it's a visual that really makes people want to act.
I agree with everything you said. In our region, non-point source pollution is really a big deal, and probably other places across the United States. And so we work with a relatively newer umbrella group of non-governmental organizations called the Sweetwater Trust, or Southeastern Wisconsin Watersheds Trust. And in working with them, I think we begin to coalesce our message. I don't know if I can give you any specific advice, because we're still on that path to creating that common vision. Where I work, we have a 2035 vision, but that's ours. We haven't sold it to all parties in the region. Certainly we've barely, scratched the surface of what we need to do. So it's a process, and working particularly with NGOs, I think, is a pretty good path for us.
I'd like to add something to my remarks. So we've been working on the message of the message is working for clean rivers, and it's about the Willamette. And we've been pounding this message for probably 2 decades now. And because of the huge cost to build our big tunnel system, we've had to increase our rates consistently at 6% annually for years, and in some cases higher. It's gotten to the point, I remember a colleague of mine went to a council meeting a while back. There was not one public resident that came in to make a comment about the rate increase, because there had been such there was some consistency over time, and they got it. They understood. They may not agree with it, but they understood why that's the case. And so consistent messaging had that type of artifact.
So we have time for 2 more questions. I have one from the back here.
2 questions, though. I think this is a question for Bill. You were talking about the gray and green infrastructure, the interaction and losing lanes of traffic. Is the culture in Portland such that that was met without resistance? And if not, what did you do to address that? The second question actually might have already been answered, and I was too dense to hear it, but does green infrastructure tend to prolong the life of gray infrastructure?
The example I showed on the Southeast Division streetscape was an agreement that the Transportation Department and the local businesses had come to. That was a big step for them. Right, they used to be pro-time lanes, so they were open during peak rush hour periods, but closed for parking during non-rush hour periods, which makes sense logically, but I think it creates a little bit of havoc in practice. So they were partially there already. Recognizing there were more parking spaces, I think it made it more amenable to the businesses there. So it took some time to get to that point. There's always a conversation we have with adjacent property owners about loss of parking. That's an issue everywhere where we work. So because of that, we try to build swales or planters, things behind the curb that still allow for parking to exist. That doesn't always happen. And so then what we end up doing is we explain why it's needed. I mean, that's a huge piece of it. But let's say we'll put the curb extension between two property lines. And so the impact of parking is affected by two instead of just one property owner. And the second thing is we almost always try to put the green infrastructure at the very bottom of the street. And so it captures as most of the street runoff as it can. That's one good thing. And two, the other thing is that that property usually has two frontages. And so the parking impact is less in those cases. And you asked whether or not the green infrastructure prolongs the life of gray. Yes, it does. Many times when we have a problem, we have to rip up the streets and replace a pipe that's in perfectly fine shape structurally. It may have 50 years of life left to it. And we can avoid doing that by putting in a pair of Green Street facilities instead and allow that pipe to continue to its design life.
So just one more question? Or not? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. Just a couple of reminders. Our very next one, actually, or the very next session in this series is going to happen next week. That is a week from tonight, same time, same place. We're going to talk about, of course, our friend and colleague Jeff Thomas in this work always talks about the sexy side of water infrastructure. Well, this is it, friends. It doesn't get much sexier than this. We're talking about innovative financing models for the kind of green infrastructure that we've been discussing since the very beginning of the segments. So please do come for that and encourage all your friends and others to do that as well. So we look forward to seeing you next time, and thanks so much.